For millions of visitors, Snoqualmie Falls is a symbol of Washington's majestic beauty. A curtain of white water plunges more than 80 meters, casting rainbows through the mist, a sight that leaves travelers in awe. Yet beneath this breathtaking view lies another truth. Danger always lingers. And sometimes, a simple visit can turn into a journey with no return. For the family of Josh Milner, a 28-year-old photographer from Seattle, Snoqualmie was never just a landmark. It became a nightmare that stretched across 3 long years. It began with one final photograph, sent in silence, and ended with a harrowing discovery. Josh's body hidden deep beneath the rocks, in a place no one thought could be reached. Josh's story is not just about a disappearance. It began with his passion for uncovering forgotten corners of nature, drifted into years of unanswered questions, and concluded with a revelation that shocked everyone who knew him. The haunting question remains: what really happened to Josh Milner at Snoqualmie Falls? Josh Milner was not the kind of visitor who came to Snoqualmie Falls just to take a postcard photo and leave. At 28, he had already carved out a reputation in Seattle as a young photographer with a restless spirit. He was the founder of a small but growing blog called Lost Waters, a project born from his fascination with the forgotten corners of the Pacific Northwest. While others were drawn to the region's famous landscapes, Josh went searching for what most people overlooked: hidden waterfalls, abandoned dams, the rusting shells of hydroelectric plants left behind by another era. Friends described him as adventurous, creative, and deeply curious, but also someone who sometimes pushed the limits of safety. He would follow deer trails into the underbrush, climb down slippery ravines, or cross fences into industrial ruins, all in pursuit of an image that no one else had captured. For Josh, photography wasn't just about beauty, it was about discovery. He believed that every abandoned structure and every unmarked cascade told a story about the way people and nature had shaped each other in the Northwest. Snoqualmie, in particular, had always held a magnetic pull for him. Beyond the main tourist overlook with its safety railings and gift shop, the area concealed a maze of forgotten trails, crumbling warehouses, and the skeleton of an old power plant built in the early 1900s. Locals knew that some of these places were dangerous, the ground unstable, the cliffs steep, the river currents unforgiving. But to Josh, they were invitations to explore. His blog posts captured this mixture of awe and risk. In one entry, he wrote about how waterfalls seemed to him like portals into another time, places where the noise of the modern world disappeared under the roar of water. Followers of Lost Waters admired not only his photos, but also the quiet, almost poetic way he described his journeys. Yet those closest to him worried. His sister recalled warning him more than once, "One day, your curiosity is going to take you somewhere you can't come back from." Still, Josh thrived in these spaces where beauty blurred with danger. He had grown up in Seattle's suburbs, but his heart belonged to the wilderness. He found in the Pacific Northwest a sense of freedom that few places could match: towering evergreens, mist-shrouded valleys, rivers cutting through basalt cliffs. To him, Snoqualmie was not simply a tourist attraction. It was a living landscape with secrets still waiting to be uncovered. And in August 2020, it was toward this landscape, with its mixture of wonder and hidden peril, that Josh Milner turned once again. He told his family he was heading out for another day of exploration. What none of them could have known was that this trip to Snoqualmie would be his last. On the morning of the 16th of August 2020, Josh Milner left his small apartment in Seattle, carrying nothing more than his worn backpack and his camera bag. He had told his family only one thing: heading to Snoqualmie, found a waterfall that isn't on any map. It was a short text, casual in tone, but to Josh, it was the kind of lead he lived for. To his family, it would later become the last normal message they ever received from him. The day was warm, with a thin veil of clouds stretching across the summer sky. Tourists crowded the main overlook at Snoqualmie Falls, their phones lifted high, capturing the same sweeping panorama that millions had captured before. But Josh wasn't interested in the official trails or the viewing platform. He parked his silver Subaru in a side lot, tucked his phone into his pocket, and disappeared toward the old service roads that ran deeper into the gorge. 3 days passed with no word. At first, his family thought little of it. Josh often spent long weekends exploring remote areas, sometimes without reception. His mother reassured herself that he would return with another collection of photos and stories to share on his blog. But when the 19th of August came and went with no contact, their concern grew heavier. By the 20th, worry hardened into fear. His sister tried calling repeatedly, but each attempt went straight to voicemail. On the 21st of August, investigators entered the picture. A search of the area near the falls quickly revealed his Subaru parked at the edge of a gravel turnout, undisturbed. Inside, his wallet and ID sat untouched. Nearby, in the back seat, officers found his camera bag, its zipper partially open, one lens cracked as though it had been dropped. It was an unsettling detail. Josh never left his camera behind. To his family, the broken lens was more than just damaged equipment. It was a sign that something had gone terribly wrong. Detectives began piecing together the timeline. The last confirmed sighting came from a hiker who remembered seeing a man in a blue jacket walking down a closed maintenance trail the same day Josh disappeared. The hiker said the man carried a tripod and moved with a sense of purpose, as though he knew exactly where he was going. From that point onward, the trail vanished. There were no footprints, no discarded gear, no cell phone pings beyond the tower that registered his departure from Seattle that morning. It was as if Josh had stepped into the woods and dissolved into the mist. For his family, the uncertainty was unbearable. Every possibility felt equally terrifying. Had he slipped on wet rock and been swallowed by the river? Had someone confronted him on the forgotten trails, far from witnesses? Or had he stumbled into some hidden corner of Snoqualmie that would not give him back? The broken lens seemed to whisper of violence, but it could just as easily have been an accident. The parked Subaru hinted at a short excursion, but 3 days without a trace suggested something more sinister. Each clue contradicted the last, leaving behind a puzzle with no clear answer. By the end of that week, search crews fanned out across the area, determined to uncover what had happened. For now, however, all anyone could say with certainty was this. On the morning of the 16th of August, Josh Milner set out to find a hidden waterfall near Snoqualmie Falls, and he never came home. The search for Josh Milner began as soon as his abandoned Subaru was found, and it quickly grew into one of the largest efforts the county had ever organized. On the 22nd of August, deputies from King County Sheriff's Office assembled alongside local search and rescue volunteers. At first, the mood carried a cautious optimism. Missing hikers in Snoqualmie had been rescued before, often found cold and hungry but alive after a few nights in the wilderness. There was hope that Josh, resourceful and experienced, might still be somewhere out there, waiting to be discovered. Over the next few days, that optimism began to erode. Search teams divided the dense forest into grids, moving methodically through underbrush so thick it swallowed sound. They combed the riverbanks, dragged the water below the falls, and lowered themselves on ropes into crevices slick with moss. Helicopters hovered overhead, sweeping the gorge with infrared cameras, while rescue dogs strained against their leashes, noses to the ground. For hours at a time, the only sound was the roar of the waterfall, drowning out the shouts of volunteers calling Josh's name. The cracked camera lens remained the only physical clue, and it troubled everyone who saw it. If Josh had fallen, why hadn't his body surfaced downstream? If he had wandered into the woods, why hadn't the dogs picked up his scent? Each day without an answer deepened the mystery. By the end of the first week, more than 500 people had joined the effort, friends, strangers, even fellow photographers who knew Josh through his blog. They searched old service roads, crumbling staircases that led down to the decommissioned power plant, and forgotten trails marked only by faint blazes on tree trunks. Snoqualmie was beautiful from the overlook, but up close it was treacherous. Jagged cliffs crumbled underfoot, and hidden caverns seemed to open without warning. Searchers returned at dusk each evening scraped, soaked, and exhausted, yet still empty-handed. One search dog stopped abruptly at the river's edge on the fourth day, pawing at the ground as though something was near. Divers went into the water again, braving the force of the current, but found nothing except driftwood and silt. Investigators began to lean toward the simplest explanation. Perhaps Josh had slipped, been pulled beneath the torrent, and carried away. The river was merciless, and in places, the undertow could hold on to its victims for months. But his family struggled to accept that theory. His mother insisted that if Josh had drowned, anything would have surfaced by now. Clothing, shoes, his camera. His sister pointed out that his tripod, usually strapped to his bag, was nowhere to be found. It was as though both man and gear had been deliberately erased. Weeks passed, and still there was no trace. Helicopter flights gave way to smaller foot patrols. Volunteers dwindled, their energy drained by the scale of the terrain. Hope narrowed to a thin thread. Each day without progress weighed heavier on the family, who camped near the falls, clinging to the belief that an answer might appear at any moment. By the third week, reality could no longer be ignored. Officials held a press conference, announcing the official suspension of the active search. Their voices carried the language of procedure. All reasonable efforts exhausted, no further leads. But behind those words was the stark truth. Josh Milner had vanished, and no one could explain how. The decision devastated his family. His mother wept openly, refusing to leave the site. His sister lingered by the river, staring at the water, as if her brother might suddenly emerge. The silence left behind by the helicopters and rescue dogs was unbearable. Where once there had been shouts and the hum of engines, now there was only the endless roar of Snoqualmie Falls, indifferent and eternal. In the end, all that remained was an empty car in a gravel lot, a broken lens in a camera bag, and questions that no one could answer. For the Milner family, the failed search was not just a logistical defeat, it was the beginning of a haunting, a space where hope and grief intertwined, with no resolution in sight. Josh had gone into the gorge searching for hidden beauty. What he left behind was a mystery vast enough to swallow 3 weeks of desperate searching, and a family that would never stop asking why. For the Milner family, the suspension of the search was not an end, but the beginning of a different kind of torment. The weeks after the official announcement felt unreal. Life outside Snoqualmie continued, but for them, time had frozen on the day Josh vanished. His Subaru was eventually towed back to Seattle, and the cracked lens was returned as evidence, though it felt more like a relic of failure. His room remained untouched, camera equipment lined up on the shelves, as if he might walk back through the door at any moment. The years that followed became a cycle of unanswered questions. In 2021, his mother still called his phone once a week, leaving messages that filled his inbox. "We're still waiting, Josh. Just come home." His sister trawled internet forums where amateur sleuths speculated endlessly about his disappearance. Some were convinced he had slipped into the river. Others whispered darker theories of foul play. Each new post raised hope for a moment before dissolving into the same empty silence. Authorities quietly moved the case into the background. On paper, it remained open. But without new leads, it slipped lower on the list of priorities. Detectives leaned toward the simplest explanation, that Josh had been claimed by the falls. To them, the lack of evidence was evidence itself. Snoqualmie had taken many lives before, and his story fit neatly into that grim history. But to his family, the neatness of that explanation was unbearable. His mother insisted that Josh would never have gone so quietly. His sister pointed out the missing tripod, the broken lens, the strange detail of his camera bag left behind. If he drowned, she would ask, why did none of it come back up? Those questions never faded. They lingered in every family gathering, in every holiday marked by an empty chair. By 2022, the weight of uncertainty became its own prison. Friends encouraged the family to move on, but the phrase felt cruel, as though they were being asked to abandon Josh entirely. The blog Lost Waters remained online, a digital ghost, its last entry frozen in time. For some, it was a memorial. For his mother, it was a wound she couldn't bear to close. Then came 2023. 3 years had passed, with no sightings, no recovered belongings, no answers. The story of Josh Milner had faded from headlines, remembered only in passing by those who had once searched for him. For everyone else, Snoqualmie Falls remained the same, a place of beauty, a tourist destination. But for one family, it was a place that had swallowed their son whole, leaving behind nothing but silence. In September of 2023, Snoqualmie Falls looked much as it always had. Mist rising from the gorge, tourists, snapping photographs, the thunder of water filling the air. Yet beneath the familiar beauty, the landscape was about to yield a secret it had kept buried for 3 long years. That month, a series of heavy storms rolled through the Pacific Northwest. Days of relentless rain triggered landslides along the cliffs, tearing away sections of rock and soil. Local hikers, drawn by curiosity to see the aftermath, ventured off the main trails to explore areas rarely touched. It was there, in a newly exposed crevice near the river's edge, that they stumbled upon something they would never forget. At first, it looked like scraps of fabric caught among the boulders. A sleeve of weathered blue, faded by time and water, clung to the rocks. But as the hikers drew closer, recognition set in. This was no discarded clothing. Entangled within the stone was the unmistakable form of a human body. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community. Authorities arrived quickly, sealing off the area. Recovery teams worked carefully, inching through unstable terrain loosened by the rains. What they pulled from beneath the rocks was a figure dressed in a tattered blue jacket, hiking boots still laced, bones brittle from years of exposure. The body was unmistakably that of a man who had not been lost to the river but hidden within the earth itself. Forensic specialists were called in, and with them a grim confirmation. The remains belonged to 8-year-old Josh Milner. 3 years of uncertainty ended in a single moment, but the answers that emerged only deepened the mystery. The first revelation came from the condition of the body. His wrists bore the marks of nylon cord, still knotted even after years underground. What had once been rope had fused to the bone. This was no accident, no simple misstep on a slick rock. Josh had been bound. The second clue was more chilling still. A fracture on the back of his skull, sharp and deliberate, told investigators he had been struck with violent force. Whatever happened that day, in 2020, it was not nature's doing. It was the act of another human being. For Josh's family, the news was devastating. The faint hope that he had simply been lost to the river dissolved, replaced by the far darker reality that someone had killed him and hidden his body. His mother, who had prayed for 3 years to see her son's face again, was forced to confront the fact that he had not just vanished into the wilderness, he had been silenced. Word spread quickly. What had once been treated as a tragic hiking accident now transformed into a homicide investigation. Locals who had long believed Josh had slipped into the water found themselves reeling from the idea that a killer had moved among them. As forensic teams cataloged the remains, one final detail emerged. Fragments of nylon rope identical to the kind used on camera bags were still knotted around his arms. It was as if the tools of his passion photography had been turned against him, used to restrain him in his final moments. The discovery beneath the rocks changed everything. Snoqualmie had not simply taken another life. The gorge had been a grave, concealing a truth far darker than anyone had imagined. And it was only through the violence of the storm, through nature itself tearing open the earth, that Josh's story was finally forced back into the light. Detectives now faced a chilling question. If Josh Milner had been murdered, then by whom and why? The investigation reopened with a fury. Detectives combed through old reports, revisiting every statement, every tip, every odd detail that once seemed insignificant. What emerged was not a single clean narrative, but a web of unsettling possibilities. The first theory centered on robbery. Josh had been known to carry expensive camera gear into the wilderness, equipment worth thousands. Perhaps he had crossed paths with someone who saw him not as a hiker, but as an opportunity. Yet investigators found no trace of his camera, Not in pawn shops, not online, not hidden in storage lockers. It had vanished as completely as Josh had, fueling suspicions that theft alone could not explain his death. The second theory was darker still. Friends recalled Josh speaking in the weeks before his disappearance about a man he sometimes encountered near the falls, someone who lingered at odd hours, watching hikers from the shadows of the trees. Josh had even joked that the stranger gave him a bad feeling. Police, at the time, dismissed the detail. Now, with evidence of murder, that unknown figure loomed large. Was he a drifter? A local? Or someone who knew Josh personally? A third theory reached closer to home. Arguments had been reported between Josh and his small circle of fellow photographers. Some spoke of jealousy over his growing portfolio, whispers of tension that never made it into official reports. Could professional rivalry have turned violent? But there was one more clue investigators could not ignore: the nylon cord binding Josh's wrists. It wasn't just any rope, it matched the kind sold with certain camera bags, a niche item only other photographers would likely possess. That detail blurred the lines between theories, hinting that Josh may have been betrayed not by a stranger in the woods, but by someone who shared his very passion. Despite these leads, no arrests were made. Suspects were questioned, alibis checked, but every trail seemed to dissolve into fog. Josh's death remained a riddle, one where the answers hovered just out of reach. And so, 3 years after he first disappeared, the truth of what happened at Snoqualmie Falls remained shrouded in silence, leaving behind not closure but an ache and a haunting sense that the killer might still be out there. In the end, the case of Josh Milner did not conclude with a clarity his family had long prayed for. The evidence suggested murder, yet no single suspect could be pinned down with certainty. The truth remained elusive, tangled between theories of robbery, rivalry, and a faceless predator haunting the forests around Snoqualmie Falls. For Josh's loved ones, that ambiguity was its own form of torment. His parents chose to cremate his remains, scattering his ashes at the very waterfalls he had adored since childhood. Standing there, they said goodbye, not only to their son, but to years of unanswered questions, releasing him back into the currents he so passionately pursued. His mother described it as both unbearable and strangely fitting that Josh's final resting place was among the waters he had dedicated his life to capturing. In the months that followed, the family founded the Lost Waters Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting search and rescue teams across Washington state. They hoped to prevent other families from enduring the same anguish, turning their grief into something that might, in time, save others. Each year, on the anniversary of his disappearance, friends and fellow photographers gathered at Snoqualmie Falls, carrying cameras slung around their shoulders, lenses pointed toward the mist, honoring the man who had taught them to look at nature with reverence and curiosity. Yet even amid remembrance, a shadow lingered. Visitors whispered about the falls, how beautiful they were, and how cruel. Some spoke of the landslides that had revealed Josh's body, almost as if nature itself had chosen to betray a secret. Others felt a chill at the thought that whoever silenced him had walked away into the same woods, unseen and unpunished. For the community, the lesson was sobering. Passion and exploration carry risks, not only from the cliffs and currents, but from the darker corners of humanity. Josh Milner's story became both a cautionary tale and a tribute to a restless soul who refused to stop searching for beauty in hidden places. And as the mist of Snoqualmie Falls drifts into the air, it carries with it the memory of a man whose final photograph was never taken. His story left etched, not in film, but in mystery. If you found Josh's story as haunting as we did, don't forget to subscribe to Last Seen. Every week, we bring you mysteries that were almost forgotten, stories of those who vanished, and the truths that time eventually uncovered. Your support helps us keep these voices alive.